Welcome back to Calgary Barbell, everybody. Now in 2018, we put together the single best, most concise and comprehensive guide to the sumo deadlift out there on YouTube. And what we want to do today is the same thing with the squat. So let's get started talking about the setup. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is we're going to try to tackle the setup components of a successful squat. And for that, we're going to go through 5 different things. We're going to go through grip width, grip style, bar placement, building the shelf, and bracing. When it comes to grip width, the general rule of thumb is that we're going to take a wider grip for people who are less flexible and a closer grip for people who are more flexible. A closer grip for most people is going to feel tighter because it bunches up the muscles of the upper back. However, in some cases, this can lead to flexibility issues, specifically in the bottom of the squat, wherein the bar starts to roll and/or the lifter loses position in their upper back. It's important that our grip width not only allows us to feel tight out of the rack, but also that we can maintain intentional contraction throughout the back and maintain that tightness throughout the full range of motion, including the bottom position of the squat. So for your average beginner, you're probably going to be somewhere between pointer finger and pinky finger on the rings of the bar, and you can go a little bit wider if you have wider set shoulders or narrower if you have narrower shoulders. Now that you have your grip width set, the next thing we're going to try to figure out is how to actually grip the bar. There are a number of different ways to do this, the first of which is what we call thumbs under. Now when we wrap our thumbs under the bar, around the bar, like you would traditionally grip it, what this is going to do is it's going to require a little bit more flexibility in the wrists and elbows. And it's going to put a little bit more stretch demand on the wrists and elbows, which is not inherently a bad thing. In some cases, and for some people, it's preferable to allow the wrists and elbows to stretch and take that extra stress as opposed to the shoulders. The other predominantly used style of grip is the thumbs over, where the thumb's going to be on the top side of the bar, also known as false grip. This is my preferred style of grip and allows me to maintain a little bit of a straighter wrist angle and allows me to kind of focus on hooking myself into the bar, thinking about pulling the bar into my back using my lats, almost like a behind the neck pull down. Now the last style of gripping the barbell is going to be what they call talon grip, where you're actually going to put your pinky finger underneath the bar. Now, for some reason, there are a lot of lifters who swear this alleviates bicep, elbow, wrist, and all kinds of shoulder pain. And for those lifters, they'll swear by it. Now, the issue with this grip is that if you are looking to compete in powerlifting, this grip may or may not be allowed depending on where you're looking to compete. So check with your federation, look into the rule books, and if you do grip like this, maybe be prepared to switch it up on the fly come meet day if, for some reason, the judge doesn't like the way it looks.
Nope, I don't like it.
So we've got our grip width figured out, we've got our grip style figured out, and now what we're going to try to perfect is bar placement. So this takes us into the debate of high bar versus low bar. People often put a lot of value on this, and truth be told, only time and experience under the bar will tell you which bar position is going to be stronger for you. All that being said, there are a few generalizations we can make to help you figure out which one you may be leaning towards in terms of your own personal preferences. The high bar or higher bar position is going to lend itself to a more upright torso, generally more forward knee movement in the squat, as well as a bit of a quicker change of direction out of the bottom. Now, if these sound like things you see in your own squats, a high or higher bar position might be the ticket for you. A low or lower bar position is going to be a style of squatting that generally utilizes more forward lean. Characteristics like a more horizontal torso angle, generally less forward knee travel, and often more control into and out of the bottom position or the deepest position of the squat are what's going to characterize a sort of low bar style squat. If this sounds like your most comfortable or most ideal style of squatting, then you may want to embrace a lower bar position. For myself, I exist pretty evenly in the middle of these two, both mechanically throughout the movement of my squat, as well as where my bar is positioned on my back. There will be plenty of lifters who sit on one end of these extremes, high bar or low bar, but there's also going to be plenty of lifters like myself who fit somewhere in the middle. All that being said, my personal advice is to just find somewhere the bar sits with relative comfort and stability throughout the entire range of motion, and don't be afraid to experiment with different bar positions, especially as variations of your squat. Now that we've got the bar where we want it, let's talk about building the shelf. Regardless of where the bar goes on your back, we're gonna need to make sure that your point of contact with the bar, which is your upper back, or what we're gonna call the shelf from now on, is able to properly stabilize the bar. We want these movements of the shoulder blade and the contractions of the muscles associated with them to be static. That is to say, once we have our shoulder blades retracted and depressed, and we have all that upper back musculature nice and tight, we don't want it to move. We don't want the length of those muscles to change much throughout the entirety of the squat. So now that we've learned how to tighten up all the muscles immediately surrounding the barbell once it's on your back, the next thing we need to think about is tightening the rest of your torso so that we can properly transfer force from your legs into the barbell for a successful squat. Now, when we talk about bracing, what we'll generally find is that people tend towards and will emulate one of two sort of styles of bracing. And I've broken these into posterior dominant and anterior dominant bracing when we look at how bracing is conceptualized, as well as the cues that go along with bracing in that fashion. When we're talking about posterior dominant bracing, it's more about a system of cues and ideas that would emphasize priority on creating and bracing the shelf of the upper back around the bar, really emphasizing depression of the scapula, and usually producing some low back extension that's going to be more or less maintained throughout the entirety of the lift. Many lifters who squat best with this style of bracing will focus a lot on pulling the bar into their back and feel like the lats and the tightness of the lats have a very strong impact on the overall tightness of the lift. Conversely, other lifters will brace by focusing on pulling the ribs down in front, sometimes creating even a little bit of flexion in the low back, and in some cases a slight bit of protraction or forward movement of the shoulder blades. Whichever side of this you land on, you'll likely find that one side or school of thought will help you not only achieve depth easier, but will help you achieve a more static trunk position throughout the entirety of the lift. Both schools of thought on bracing, however, will use what's called the Valsalva maneuver, wherein a lifter basically just takes in a bunch of breath into their trunk and tries to force it out against the abdominal wall, or in most cases, the lifter's lifting belt, in an effort to increase and produce more pressure and stability throughout the trunk between the rib cage and the pelvis. Now we've gone through the setup for the powerlifting style squat. The next thing that we're gonna cover, obviously, is gonna be the lift. And that's gonna be comprised of the walkout, setting your stance width, the descent or downward phase of the movement, finding depth, and the ascent or the upward phase of the movement. Now, the walkout is a really underrated and important part of the squat. In both equipped and raw lifting, this can really make or break your squat in a lot of ways. I think the most common mistake people make here is that, number one, their unrack or the picking up of the bar is rushed, and we're not approaching it as if we're already in a squat. So that's one of my biggest cues, is to imagine picking the bar up like you're already in the midst of a max effort squat. Don't lose any of that tightness. Don't lose that bracing that we just talked about for 10 minutes and you put so much work into creating. Maintain that when you pick up the bar. The next big mistake that a lot of people make is taking far too many steps and shuffling and dancing around and ending up a mile back from the rack, and then adjusting for stance width, and then wiggling their toes in for 4 seconds. The goal with our walkout should be a 2 to 3 step approach. So you're gonna pick up the bar, you're gonna take 1 step back from the rack, 2 steps back from the rack, and at this point, if you're really good, you're gonna be at your appropriate stance width. The 3-step approach would be when you simply add in another step to adjust one side so that your stance width is where you want it to be. When you walk your squat out, you're gonna wanna walk it out into your squat stance. Now, one thing that a lot of people talk about back and forth a lot on is stance width. And more or less it's determined by how your hip anatomy all fits together. A very simple test for you to figure out where you could start with your squat stance width is to simply lay on your back, bring your knees up to your chest in different widths. So you can have a friend or training partner kind of manipulate your leg up and down and just see at what width are you able to achieve something close to a powerlifting squat depth most comfortably. Some more general rules to help get you started is that if you are a higher bar squatter with a more upright torso and all those things we talked about earlier, you might want to start out a little bit narrower. Whereas if you're a lower bar squatter and you tend to be a little more sat back, you might want to start out a little bit wider. The long and short of it is that once again, you're probably going to need to experience squatting a number of different ways to figure out what is optimal for you. Now, a real quick aside about toe angle. Generally speaking, if you're more narrow, start more toes forward. If you're a little bit wider, toe your feet out a little bit more. Try and think about the whole stacked joints principle that we talked about in our sumo deadlift video, where you kind of want the angle of your femur in the bottom to be in line with your toe. Obviously, again, exceptions to this rule, but that's a good place to start. So we've walked the squat out, we've got our stance width and our toe angle and everything figured out. Let's start the damn lift. Now, there's often a great deal of discussion about how we should initiate the squat, and more or less there's two main takes. Conventional wisdom would say that you should either bend at the hips first or bend at the hips and the knees at the same time. Very rarely will we, in powerlifting at least, try to get people to bend at the knees first, and here's why. I often have to coach lifters who are trying to stay as upright as possible. When you watch a rather novice lifter, a lot of the times they think their torso needs to stay really straight up and down. What happens is that in order to get to depth, you're gonna need to push the hips back more. And what that causes is a shift in torso angle in the bottom of the squat when we're at our sort of worst leveraged position. And this can cause a lot to go wrong in the squat. So all that is to say that basically as we descend, we want to make sure we set our torso angle at a maintainable position. We don't want to see a big shift or change in the torso angle throughout the squat, specifically as we hit the bottom and start coming back up. So on the descent, if we can get the appropriate angle, then we can keep it for the rest of the lift. So now we've got this bar on our back and we're basically in free fall. At what point do we stop and come back up? AKA, what is depth? Squat depth is something that seems to be pretty contentious. A lot of people seem to have pretty vague ideas about what squat depth is. We can use powerlifting as a reference to say that squat depth, officially, is when the crease of the hip travels below the top of the knee. I think this is a pretty good proxy for most average gym goers to try to get at least the hip crease in line with the top of the knee, if not below. However, if you're not competing in powerlifting, then it doesn't really matter. But you should go as low as you comfortably can to get the most out of the work that you're doing. Another real quick caveat for anybody who isn't competing in powerlifting, your squat depth should be consistent from your lightest sets to your heaviest sets. And you should hold those heavy sets and heavy reps to that same standard as you would squat 95 pounds or 135 pounds. Don't just load it up and then trim range of motion to look like you're doing more. All right, so now we've hit perfect, picturesque depth. We just gotta stand back up, right? Yes, more or less. The idea of the ascent of the squat is basically just to go from the bottom position to standing up. However, this is where I see probably the single biggest fault in squatting time and time again. So we're gonna talk about the dreaded squat morning. So more or less the squat morning occurs when people hit the bottom of the squat, they start coming back up, and their hips start to rise at a rate faster than the bar starts to rise. This causes lifters to get pitched forward and in some cases even miss their squats as a result of this. The number one way I try to coach lifters to avoid the squat morning is basically we need to get the load to stay on the quads. What happens when we squat morning is that the quads are basically ditching the load and putting it all on your hips and back. Now, that's not a bad thing. You're not gonna hurt yourself because you're lifting with your back. Just throw that out of your head because it's an old antiquated notion. However, it's not the most efficient. So, a few things you can do to avoid the squat morning. Number one, think about keeping your knees forward as you come up out of the bottom. Now, I'm not saying drive your knees forward harder all the way through the lift, but simply don't let them shoot back. If you watch anybody squat morning, the hips shoot back and the knees shoot back as well. Keep those knees forward. Another thing I often coach my lifters to do is keep some pressure on the front of your foot. Actively drive your toes down as you push up out of the bottom. Again, for some reason, this really helps to keep those knees forward and keep some of those things a little bit more in alignment as we come up out of the bottom. The other way we can come at this is from smart exercise programming when it comes to your squat and your squat-like movements. Number one, don't train above your pay grade. If you can't lift properly, don't use that weight yet. It seems trivial, dumb, obvious, straightforward, but maybe there's some people out there that need to hear that. If this is happening to you, use less weight, use a weight where this doesn't happen to you, and then gradually progress while keeping those bad habits at bay. The other thing we can do is modify the squat in an accessory day or as an alternate squat during the week, and use something like a pin squat or a pause squat, which we've talked about in other videos. And those can help you learn the mechanics of getting up out of the hole a little bit more efficiently. And with that, hopefully we've set our squat up, we've braced, we've put the bar on our back, everything's tight, we sat down, we hit depth, and we stood up. So if you have any further questions about the squat, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. Make sure to tune into our Form Check Fridays or go back through the catalog of the many videos we've spent critiquing squats if you want to learn a couple more nuanced approaches to all this stuff. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos like this one. Leave a like if you liked it and share it with your friends if you think they might get some benefit from it. And we'll see everybody in the next video. Thank you all for watching.